morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Does that sound reasonable? All right. I hope that you can hear me clearly. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to speak with you this morning. And, as I mentioned from time to time in my lessons, and I've done a few of these, I like to look through the scripture and find verses that reference purpose. And because I think it's important. I mean, all of us who live in the world from time to time ask the question, why am I here? And what should I be doing? And people in the godless worldview range ask the same question. And it's very confusing when people in the world say, why am I here and what is my purpose? Because in a misguided world, it's very complicated, and the answer is, often false, misleading, meaningless, this kind of thing for people in the world who say, what's my purpose? It can be very vague, and you know what I'm talking about. So as Christians, however, the Bible gives us a finer focus on what this can be. And in fact, when you look at people who comment on what should purpose be, an atheist, Richard Dawkins, says, well, the purpose for each of us is actually an invented purpose. And that's the best that we can get, is a purpose that's invented for us. But the Bible gives us way more than that. And so I want to look at a verse this morning in 1 Timothy chapter 4. Now, as usual, you can turn along if you like, but I'm going to have verses on the board, on the screen to reference as well. So we're going to look at 1 Timothy 4, verse 7. It says there, discipline yourself for the purpose of godliness. And when you look at this, it's like, well, godliness sounds really easy, because if I'm going to be, worldliness means being like the world. Manliness means being like a man. Cleanliness, being clean, these kind of things. But is godliness so easily defined? I want to look at that for a few minutes this morning. What is godliness? Does it mean that I have to be like God? How can we be like God? And is that what it's really about? So how can we really practice godliness? To help define this, I want to compare for a moment godlikeness versus godliness. Genesis 1:26, it says, then God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. I love this verse so much because it reminds me exactly of where we come from the great creator God. We've been given his image on each of us. We've been given a certain measure of the creator. All of us bear what's called the imago Dei, the image of God. And we've been made in that way by the great creator, the one and only creator God. And this is a drastic contrast to naturalism, of course, which says what? That we're made in some semblance of a beast. But that's not where we come from. We've been made in the image of God. God says we're made like him in that way. So God-likeness is a biblical subject, of course. Ephesians 5:1 says, be imitators of God. And so there are ways in which we can be like God's traits. We can be loving, we can be wise, we can be just, we can be good and faithful and long-suffering. Those we should do. But I do want to look closer at godliness utilized in 1 Timothy chapter 4. And we're going to look at the Greek here, where it says, discipline yourself for the purpose of godliness. It says for the purpose of Eusebia. And I have it here on the board. This is defined as piety, especially towards God to worship, or towards parents to respect. Now, the funny thing is, I use the word piety in my daily language about as much as I use Eusebia. Okay? So I had to look up piety as well because I just don't think about that word. And so piety is defined as the state or quality of being devoted, religious, and reverent. And it's translated, this Eusebia word is translated in the King James Version 14 times as godliness and 1 time as holiness. And some sort of more regular language that we might use is also allegiance, fidelity, and loyalty. So these are the sense of things that we should have when we're talking about have the purpose of godliness, have the purpose of a God-focused loyalty and a God-focused fidelity. Vines also says it's that piety which is characterized by a Godward attitude and does that which is well-pleasing to Him. So I hope that helps kind of define what we're talking about, this devotion, this loyalty, this fidelity. Now, to help increase our understanding of this, I want to compare 2 types of piety because, to my surprise, when I was doing research on this, when you look up piety, you will also find a lot of instances in the Bible about false piety, a misplaced piety. So piety by itself doesn't mean specifically God-focused, which is why Vine says what we're talking about really is God-focused piety. But there are verses where we find that, just like in many things, people get confused and they do things the wrong way. 2 Timothy 3, Paul warns us here. He says, "But mark this, there will be terrible times in the last days. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of good, treacherous, rash, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God." Now that's a lot of terrible things. But then it says, having a form of godliness, but denying its power. So the Greek again here says having a form of godliness is morphusin Eusebius. So like metamorphosis, right? Changed piety. Now none of that stuff sounds like devotion to God at all, and you can see that. But it's a form of godliness, a fake godliness, a changed piety that is utilized here. So in some ways, for whatever reason, the example is people might try to look like they're respecting God, but it's only outward, it's only meant to please self. Clearly in the greater reading of that, you can see those are the things that don't please God. And so that is a false piety. This reminds me, and I want to refer to a major set of verses where Jesus warned about a similar thing in Matthew 6. Sorry, I missed completely. False piety, self-focused. True piety, what we're talking about is a real and honest, God-focused devotion. I want to compare to Matthew 6 because all this reminds me of what Jesus said here. He said, "Take care not to practice your righteousness in the sight of people to be noticed by them." This is right along the same lines of the form of godliness. And Jesus explains and accurately labels people like this as hypocrites. He says, in the example, and I'll just summarize, they give to the needy, but they do so with a trumpet sound, right? To bring attention to it. And some of them would pray, but they would pray in the streets loudly just to be heard. And it's such a good example because those are good things, right? Is there anything wrong with giving to the needy? No. Is there anything, wrong with praying? Absolutely not. But they're doing it with the wrong intent, looking for approval from men instead of approval from God. Jesus said, well, they do this clearly to get honor from men and get the praise from men. But true godliness is characterized by that God-focused attitude that we're going to talk about, devoting ourselves to the will of God. So how can we develop true piety, true devotion, true godliness? I am going to use Jesus' examples in Matthew 6 as an easy transition because a good starter here. Hypocrisy, of course, means doing one thing when you're trying to make it look like something else. That's what that means. Doing one thing meaning something else. So what we want to do when it comes to giving, of course, instead of giving to be seen, we want to give in order to help. That's the reason giving is done, is to truly offer help. Praying, so simply, prayer is between us and God, such a personal thing that someone would try to use that and make it look, outward and showy because it's a personal matter. And so we would never pray to be heard. We would pray honestly because we've been given that opportunity by God. And fasting, I didn't mention it a second ago, but fasting is another one that Jesus referenced. And as if the other two, giving and praying, aren't, shameful enough, this is perhaps the most obvious because fasting is in and of itself supposed to say that I am denying my needs so I can focus on God. Yet these people would say, they're doing this show and they're saying, look how much I don't need these needs. Look at me, I don't even need it. And that's what they're doing, using fasting to lie, basically, to show this. So they've done in a God devotion appearing actions, but Jesus says they've received their reward in full. Only the mere praise of men. But what we want is a recognition to honor God and do the things that please God. This reminds me of John 21. In the post-resurrection appearance in John 21, Jesus asked Peter, do you love me? And I know you're familiar with this, so I'm not going to go through it in all of its detail. But Jesus says, do you love me more than these? And at this time, Peter has taken a break from preaching, right? He says, I'm going to go fishing. That's what he's doing. And Jesus says, do you love me more than these? And in the context, you recognize that Jesus says 3 times, do you love me? And 2 of those 3 uses a very deep, personal agape. Do you really love me? And Peter says 3 times, you know I like you a lot. You know that I like you, Lord. You know it. And the very fact that he adds in, you know I do, is sort of just weakening his claim. Jesus says, do you love me? And he says, I like you. And so we see that juxtaposition of this. And each time he gives him an assignment. He says, feed my sheep, tend my lambs. Because he's asking for Peter to do something. He's giving him a formal and real purpose. And it's really wonderful. He's giving him a purpose and basically predicting the rest of his life from that point in that post-resurrection appearance. And after that exchange of, do you love me? Sure, I love you. Do you love me? Sure, I love you. Do you love me? Sure, I love you. He stops and he says, he changes, and he gives him a prophecy about his future. And he prophesies his honorable death. And I think it's tremendous, actually. He says, someone else will put your belt on you, and they will take you where you don't want to go. And he said this, indicating by what kind of death he would glorify God. And I think this has a lot of significance here. I wonder if it's, is it uncomfortable to Peter that he's saying this? I don't know that. Or instead, is it possibly comforting? The very fact that Jesus is prophesying his death, an honorable death as a martyr, by which he would glorify God. Perhaps a nod back to, I can't remember if it's 40 or 50 days prior, where he denied Jesus. But he says, this time you won't deny me. You'll die honorably. You'll glorify God. I think the latter, and I believe that is true. God and Jesus want us to have true devotion and dedication to them, to their cause. We're talking about those who truly want God in their lives and who will draw near to him. Hebrews 11:6 says, and without faith, it is impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. Now, tying into this, both the drawing to God and also just a quick aside for a moment on the terminology of reward, I want to go back to Matthew 6. It's interesting. I want to talk about rewards for a moment. The Bible does not avoid the subject of rewards. We see this in Hebrews, and I'm going to share quite a few verses here, or just a few. But back in Matthew 6, this phrase is mentioned 3 times. Matthew 6, verse 4, verse 6, and verse 18. Your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. And that's significant, right? There is a nature of reward. In Luke 14, Jesus tells the story about throwing a large banquet. He says, don't invite all your rich buddies. Invite some people who can't repay you. For you'll be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. There's another example in how we work for our employers. Those of us who have employers, Colossians 3:32. Whatever you do your work heartily, as for the Lord and not for people, knowing that it's from the Lord that you will receive the reward of the inheritance. 1 Corinthians 9, a very similar context, verse 24 through 27. Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but only one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may win. Everyone who competes in the games exercises self-control in all things. They then do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. Therefore, I run in such a way as not without aim. I box in such a way as not beating the air, but I discipline my body and make it my slave, so that after I've preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified. This speaks of serious competition and a prize, a little bit of a reward. So, hold on a minute. Should we do actions for a reward? Well, on one hand, of course, The Bible clearly says not to do things for the praise and honor from men. But on the other hand, it teaches us to run to win the prize. So which one is right? And the answer is clear. We do things for the chief motivation to please God. That's what we're talking about. Devotion to God, doing it to please God. But the Bible is clear that as an added benefit of pleasing God, drawing near to him, Hebrews 11:6, like we read, there is a reward. It's not a physical reward, of course. It's spiritual. It's future. Nothing to be seen by men. As Paul teaches in 1 Corinthians, we just read, with the correct God-pleasing motivation, nothing should hold us back. We should run to win. For our employers, it doesn't say work half-heartedly. It says work with your whole heart. We run with an aim and a goal to win. I've heard many lectures, many people, atheists say, well, you're just doing the good things to get the reward. But there are so many other, facets to it. Even the Apostle Paul, in a few verses back, he's not focused on himself. He's not focused on rewards, even though it exists there. He says, I want to win more men to the Lord. I want to, by all means, save some. And this is our same motivation, to be a great example for God, to influence others and bring them to Christ when we can. Without a doubt, Paul is showing us an example of sincerity, doing actions for the right purpose with devotion to God. For our last portion, I want to look back to 1 Timothy 4. I'm going to open up the context a little bit here. Read verse 7 and 8. It says, have nothing to do with irreverent, silly myths. Discipline yourself for the purpose of godliness. For bodily discipline is only of little profit, but godliness is profitable for all things, since it holds promise for the present life and also for the life to come. To this point, I hope I've explained what godliness is, this true and focused devotion, respect, and dedication for the things that please God. But in this verse, it puts more emphasis on discipline, right? And I know you're thinking, I was totally into this until you said discipline. In fact, it happens twice in this couple of verses. But even in the larger context of the chapter, and really the book, it's talking about people abandoning the faith, people slipping away, people getting distracted. But Paul, writing to Timothy, says, remain focused. Don't get distracted here with irreverent, silly stories. Your version may say old wives' tales. That's the Greek word used here. Silly stories. Don't get distracted by them, because that's not the focus. Discipline yourself. It's so very easy in today's world to be distracted. It really is. It happens to all of us, and I don't know if it's phones or activities or hobbies or things like this can distract us from the right and best goals of being the best Christian we can, being the best father we can, all of those things. And what we have much motivation for here is stay disciplined, stay focused, don't get distracted. I have distraction, it happens to all of us. I have a simple example. I even asked Hayden if I could share this, but there's just different things that distract us. If I have an activity and I say, Hayden, let's go mow. I'm going to mow. You're going to weed eat. He's like, yeah, Daddy, let's do this. 45 seconds later, I'm like mowing, best day of my life. I love mowing. And Hayden has stopped weed eating because he found a frog, right? And when you find a frog, you got to stop, and check out that frog. And there may be things in your life and my life that are like that, that draw us away for a moment from the task. And that is okay. It's fine in some ways. But we need to make sure that we have discipline, that we don't spend time, being devoted to distraction, but that we stay focused on our task. Paul here is just saying, be disciplined. It takes that to be successful, and we need to avoid distraction, focus on devotion and loyalty in the same way that we focus on bodily discipline. Now, if we tie in this with 1 Corinthians 9, there's a lot of emphasis on physical bodily discipline, like exercise and things like that. And we have all different ways that we might discipline our body and our lifestyles. I mean, maybe you get 9 hours of sleep a night, or maybe you wake up at 4:30 because you want to be super productive, or maybe you exercise, you work, super hard, you drink 5 cups of coffee, you do all these things, you do mental exercises, you walk, run, jog, whatever, to keep your body in whatever shape you want to keep it in, right? Your mental state. You do all those things. And in your life, you know what I'm talking about. Paul here is saying it's like that, but with godly devotion. So whatever those things are that you're doing, use that same focus. Schedule it, plan it, think it with a focus on godly devotion. So you see, with the proper spiritual awareness, we can do this. We can be focused. We can have our spiritual workout. And Paul, the point is, he says, bodily discipline, it's good, but it's not the best. And so we need to employ the same for spiritual discipline as well. A few verses later, Paul expounds on it, still in the same context, but he says, in addition, in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, and purity, show yourself an example of those who believe. So Paul's giving a lot of options here on how we can spend this mental, spiritual energy and focusing on how to find outlets for it. So we've got a lot of options, and it's almost like Paul saying, don't forget to exhaust any option. Go ahead and try that, do this. Of course, not to merely check it off, not to make these look like outward shows, but in true devotion. So each of us can do this in any way, every day. The last verse I want to read this morning is from the book of James. I, like many of you, love the book of James, brother of Jesus. The concept here is, do what the word says, which, confirms our study on being devoted here this morning. James 1, 19 through 25 says, "My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness of God, or that God desires. Therefore, get rid of all moral filth and the evil that is so prevalent, and humbly accept the word planted in you, which can save you. Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves." A lot of times it seems like listening is good enough. Listening does a lot. But he says, do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. Anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like someone who looks at his face in a mirror and after looking at himself goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. But whoever looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom and continues in it, not forgetting what they've heard, but doing it, they will be blessed in what they do. It's the same kind of idea. Discipline against distraction, remembering what is heard, focusing on what is right, and an emphasis on the word do. I didn't count how many times it shows up there, but it's several. We need to do what we hear. So, in conclusion, to wrap up this morning, I hope I've shown at least a small portion of this wonderful purpose example that we have the purpose of godliness, and not merely trying to do the things that God does, but showing our true devotion to God, our dedication to God, true godliness, doing actions for the right reasons, and discipline for godliness, training to limit distractions and to stay focused. I sincerely appreciate your attention this morning, and I hope this has been helpful to you. At this time, we do have an opportunity of invitation. If anyone is in a situation of need, especially if there are those who are not baptized, not immersed, not part of the kingdom. Every example that we read tells us that we want you to be part of the church. Jesus and God want you to be with them, united, and in communion with them. And if you're not, you should be. If there are others who need the prayers of the church, then we open it up at this time for you to come forward while we stand and sing.